Okay, good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. My name is Asa Mittman. I have been asked to step in and chair this panel, which I'm delighted to do. This is panel 1B, if you are in the correct place, for Monstrous Ecologies. We have 3 speakers, who you can see here. We'll do the usual thing of having I will introduce each speaker in turn, they will speak, and then we'll have the collective Q&A at the end. Our first speaker will be Avalon Manley from Indiana University of Pennsylvania, who will be speaking to us on, quote, "You cannot kill me in a way that matters. Liminality, mushrooms, and the transformative uncanny of fungal horror."
Cool. Thank you. Sorry, it's not very convenient. All right. Good morning, everybody. Nice to see you all. Does this work? Can you hear me? Okay, great. Here we go. Fungi are bizarre. They spring up overnight, seemingly from nothing. They feast in the dark upon decay. Mold enzymes have given humans everything from penicillin to laundry detergent. Some mushrooms are edible. Some are only edible the one time. And others have psychedelic properties. Some are symbiotic, networking whole ecosystems, while others still are parasitic and transformative, overtaking hosts for their own ends. It only makes sense for fungi to feature in horror stories. They are alien parts of our own terrestrial experience, foreign agents rendering the familiar strange. And show up in horror stories they do, again and again, in stories from myriad decades and diverse locations and voices. Leah Rachel von Essen, in an overview of fungal horror for Book Riot, speculates that mushrooms are signifiers of the deep rot at the center of horror story settings. That is, the derelict manors and haunted houses, once glamorous, which are crumbling under the weight of their inhabitants' secret sins. Von Essen goes on to say that fungi in these settings can grow anywhere, can spread, can infect, much like secrets themselves are wont to do. This, however, feels reductive. Mushrooms do more than grow in the background of many horror stories as a mirror for characters' corruption. In much fungal horror, it is an agent of transformation. If you, like me, were on Tumblr circa 2008 to 2014, somewhere in there, you have very likely seen this post, followed by that last answer from its questioning poster. In the spirit of decay as an extant form of life, I would like to engage with you the idea that fungal horror features mushrooms because they represent an end of the recognizable self, a transformation of the familiar that fosters in us dread in the face of an existence we can no longer understand or control. And fungal horror seems to do this in 2 distinct ways. In fungal horror, people are typically transformed in one of those 2 ways. Either their bodies are overtaken by the infection and they become effectively dead, consumed zombie hosts for the fungal growth, or their bodies are joined with the infection, retaining their consciousness in some capacity as they metamorphosize into something entirely new. Both kinds of fungal transformation serve similar narrative purposes, though I will be focusing on the latter with you this morning. They visibilize the inevitability of death and decay, which humans work so hard to ignore. And they use the terror inherent at the end of the familiar self to tell stories about marginalization, about race and class and gender and sexuality. The liminal state of fungi, neither plant nor animal, something between and altogether outside, is a mechanism for expressing the liminal stories of liminal people. So let's look at a couple of examples. Among them, an early entry in the fungal horror genre, William Hope Hodgson's 1907 short story, The Voice in the Night, which has been adapted several times in television and film. In this story, shipwrecked unfortunates become infected by strange fungi, which transform them into something new. Unlike lycanthropy, fungal transformation is not a periodic otherness, wherein some vestige of the human remains waiting to be horrified by its own animalism. It is not possession, wherein an other inhabits the former shell of the self. Fungal transformation is an Ovidian metamorphosis, a complete consumption of the familiar body, an ending of the familiar self, and the beginning of a different way of being. It is perhaps not so strange, then, that the first line of dialogue spoken by one of the infected in The Voice of the Night is, "You need not be afraid," like some Old Testament angel. In the proximity to horror and wonder of transformation, the unnamed speaker of The Voice in the Night is the personification of Freud's uncanny sublime, the species of the frightening that goes back to what was once well known and had long been familiar. The speaker and his shipwrecked wife upon becoming infected by the fungus, realize that they are forever separated from the rest of mankind for fear of spreading their affliction, explaining to the sailor who tries to save them that it would be unallowable to go among healthy humans. Their previous familiar lives, like their previous familiar bodies, are gone, replaced by the fungus, which brings with it not just a new shape, but new appetites and new desires. The speaker and his wife experience stifled craving, a mortal desire to consume the fungus that grows on their bodies and hasten their transformation from within, which the speaker describes as sudden, very terrible thoughts. They experience desire on the heels of revulsion and know that the desire did not come from the selves that they knew. At the end of the story, the speaker refers to them as we who had been human, met with a monstrous end. But he doesn't have a name for whatever they have become. In the essay Monster Culture, Jeffrey Jerome Cohen expounds upon this uncanny mixing of the familiar human and the unfamiliar monstrous, noting that the categories human and monster are coincipient, mutually constitutive, monstrously hybrid. The fungus and the speaker are inextricable, two components of a hybrid newness, and he does not want what humans want and cannot name what the fungus wants apart from the need to spread. The speaker is rendered liminal, neither fungus nor man, terrifyingly terrestrial and altogether alien, a mixed category resisting any classification, as Cohen puts it. He's also, as Meeker and Zasbari note in From the Century of the Pods to the Century of the Plants, alluring. They explain that human will cannot be imposed upon vegetation, even from within, and that things like fungal transformations represent a final defeat of human impulse. Quote, "The plant horror genre seems to show us what happens when desire disappears. We witness desire's end as the takeover brings about the demise of human need and feeling." Fungal transformation then slides further into the uncanny. Inherent in it then is what Freud called the intellectual uncertainty necessary for the novel to be frightening. The recognizable self in such transformations is not just repressed, it is gone. And we cannot fathom that which replaces it, or what vestiges of our consciousness might remain after, which stirs in us both horror and fascination. Without our desires and our drives, our connections and impulses, there is not much of the human left in us. This is a kind of death, but one where the transformed continue to exist in unfamiliar novel patterns. It's metamorphosis, but not oblivion. We crave to understand the end of the self, and stories of fungal transformation present, as Meeker said, a form of being that is both emotionless and productive. The extinction of human desire within the otherworldly need of the plant holds its own visceral and spectacular appeal. The fungal hybrid in The Voice of the Night is, in Cohen's words, difference made flesh come to dwell among us. In this difference, fungal horror is also uniquely well-positioned to explore other kinds of alterity, not just human and not human, but aspects of othering, like race and class and gender and ability. So while The Voice in the Night does little to explore lines across human difference, Sorrowland by Rivers Solomon follows the pregnant, teenage, queer, black, disabled Vern as she escapes the cult that raised her. Alone in the woods, she births twins and raises them through toddlerhood in the wilderness, until a worsening sickness forces her to seek help. Gradually, Vern learns that she is infected by a fungus and is undergoing a brutal transformation from the inside out. With the aid of an indigenous Witkey woman, an identity that translates incompletely but at least partially to transness, she manages to survive a process that evokes the historical terrorism of experimentation on black bodies without consent, becoming something terrifying, powerful, and alien. She, as Cohen puts it, unsettles what has been constructed to be received as natural, as human. In many ways throughout her young life, her blackness, queerness, and visual disability did that work for her. But the manifestation of a chitin carapace across her ribs and back underscore her otherness, her intersectional liminality. In a way very different from pregnancy, Vern understood that a stranger was growing inside her, and that she was becoming something new, something capable of things neither human nor fungus could manage alone. Brutalizing as it is, Vern never rails against her transformation. She accepts it as a new, strange state of being, a new kind of otherness. In becoming hybrid with the fungus inside her, Vern also experiences new drives and new kinships, and her relationships must shift to accommodate the thing she is becoming. She acknowledges the end of herself and the arrival of something new, which might not recognize her children. She says, "Mom would be a pile of skin and guts and skeleton, and the creature, clean and bright, would never know that she used to be a mom." Meeker and Zasbari speculate that vegetal transformation, and for our purposes, fungal transformation, alters how human communities and human bonds, public and private, may be sustained at the moment of confrontation with modes of being that are strange to us, even as we recognize ourselves in them. With the end of human drives comes the end of human connection, and what follows must be liminal and new. It must contain all of Vern, both human and fungus, just as her earlier existence occurred at the intersection of multiple concurrent identities. As Verne explains, life couldn't be broken into discrete parts and studied like counters in a child's math toy. And when she meets another like her, a fungal-human hybrid, she is struck with awe and hope and horror. She experiences what those who witness her also experience. As Cohen puts it, we distrust and loathe the monster at the same time we envy its freedom and perhaps its sublime despair. Verne's transformation does not kill her, but it does ensure she can never return to what was, bringing with it both that freedom and despair. Much fungal horror, though, does revolve around death. Fungus in nature marks the presence of decay as it works to metamorphosize rot into soil. Mushrooms are the fruiting bodies of subterranean mycelia and serve as a signpost, a reminder of what awaits us all in death. In this way, fungi reveal that which we willfully avoid confronting, our own inevitable death and decay. This transformation, not the familiar self into an unfamiliar self, but the self via decay into inanimate unconscious matter, inspires uncanny terror in a way that Cohen describes as ambient. That is, a kind of total fear that saturates day-to-day living. Freud posited that the belief in one's immortal soul persists as a defense against annihilation. Humans witness decay and experience what he described as the defensive urge that ejects it from the ego as something alien. That is, we witness decay and answer, not I. Fungi are functionally the engines of annihilation as they decompose physical bodies, a process so fraught that in the US there are whole industries dedicated to shielding the populace from witnessing decay. Each year, according to the Green Burial Council, we bury 4.3 million gallons of embalming fluids, 20 million feet of wood, 1.6 tons of concrete, 64,000 tons of steel, and 17,000 tons of copper and bronze. Humans put so much effort into avoiding reminders of mortality that mushrooms, visible and pervasive as they are, come to represent the inevitable end that awaits all of us, kingdoms Animalia and Plantae both. The very process of decomposition reaffirms the liminality of fungi. In the way that sin-eaters were neither priests nor occultists, but dwelt in the space between categories, fungus exists in ways that borrow from both plants and animals, but still claims its own entirely separate taxonomic category. Live science notes that fungi cannot, for instance, photosynthesize. Unlike plants, mushrooms do not contain the chlorophyll necessary to metabolize their nutrients from sunlight. Instead, much like animals, fungi must absorb nutrition from organic compounds. But unlike animals, mushrooms lack the motility that is often used to characterize creatures which move to gather nutrients. While animals digest organic nutrients within their bodies, fungi excrete enzymes into organic matter, which facilitate external digestion. This is also why mushrooms can flourish across such a variety of surfaces. Their hyphae and mycelium absorb nutrients via this externalized process. Mushrooms do not grow and root as plants do from seeds. Their growth above ground is sudden, often spontaneous, because those are the visible fruiting bodies of vast underground networks of mycelial tissue, spread via spore. Bless you. These mycelial networks can be huge, and they can connect whole ecosystems in ways not yet fully understood. But in Nature Fast and Slow, Nicholas Money notes that fungi operate as individuals, engage in decision-making, are capable of learning, and possess short-term memory. Not thinking in the way a brained animal thinks, but the fundamental mechanisms to process information are the same as those at work in our bodies. It makes sense that we are discomfited by mushrooms. The transformations of characters in Sorrowland and Voice in the Night are horrifying, but they are also morally neutral. They simply are, not evil or good, but terrifying in their indifference. They suggest the end of ourselves, our knowledge, our way of being, and our eventual participation in a larger cycle that may not recognize us the way we recognize ourselves. Meeker and Zasbari add that in decay, the vulnerability of the human becomes all the more the source of horror. Verne describes the process in Sorrowland. In the woods, it doesn't matter that there is no patch of earth that has not known bone, known blood, known rot. It feeds from that. It grows the trees, the mushrooms. It turns sorrows into flowers. This kind of fungal transformation decenters humanity in the story of itself, and we are unnerved by the shift away from the middle of our own narrative. In Mexican Gothic, mycelial strands encase and overtake a derelict estate, including the body of a woman who was sacrificed for its subsistence. The novel follows Noeme, a debutante from Mexico City, on a mission to rescue her newlywed cousin from an unhappy marriage into the Doyle family, a line of white patriarchal eugenicists. During her time at the Doyle estate, Noeme breathes the spores that pervade the woodwork of the house, which induce a dream state, wherein she shares memories and experiences with the house's inhabitants, both living and dead, evoking the idea of class conflict and racial and gender depressions as a kind of smog that pervades our atmosphere, a la Dr. Beverly Tatum. Eventually, Noeme uncovers the body of the woman below the house, and she describes it in religious terms. She was clothed in a different finery. Mushrooms hid her nakedness. They grew from her torso and belly, down her arms and legs. They clustered around her head, creating a crown, a halo of glowing gold, a cathedral of mycelium, the creation of an afterlife, furnished with the marrow and the bones and the neurons of a woman made of stems and spores. It would be good to rest there, and maybe they'd cover her, the lovely fungi, and cram into her mouth, into her nostrils and eye sockets until she could not breathe, and they nestled in her belly and bloomed along her thighs. The world would be a blur of gold. So here we see an echo of that blend of terror and awe that characterized The Voice in the Night. The fungi of Mexican Gothic are not a transformative force severing the self from the familiar. Instead, the mushrooms act as preservationists, surviving on the murdered woman, memorializing her maltreatment and death. This kind of potential existence, a mind married to the mycelia and safe from the predation of the Doyle men who hunt her, is intoxicating to Noeme for a moment. But when she burns the body, igniting the whole mycelial network, Noeme imagines the house burning like a brain, neurons igniting as the hyphae in the walls spread the blaze. In this novel, as in Sorrowland, fungi are a mechanism for exploring the stories of people who live and die at the margins and intersections of society, devoured by external forces that need them to survive. The mushrooms that grew in the walls were symbols of moral decrepitude, sure, but they were also an effective representation of the tangled, destructive web of capitalist exploitation upheld by the Doyle family, white imperialists whose silver mine bolstered their fortune and killed enough workers to warrant building a company cemetery. The burning mycelia are a brain and a body, a network sustained on the bodies of people that the Doyles found less than human, and its transformation into ash is a victory for more than just Noeme. So while there is space for more nuanced research into this genre, particularly, perhaps, I think its close relationships to stories about extraterrestrial or vegetal infection, as well as the role of more traditional zombie narratives in this conversation, fungal horror encapsulates anxieties surrounding mortality, decay, conceptions of the self, and the allure of the monstrous all in one. By exploring fungal transformation, both human into monster and human into rot, the genre offers us glimpses into our own relationships with nature, death, and ourselves. The liminality of fungi also renders it a vehicle to efficiently and powerfully convey stories about marginalized others. Fungi are both mechanism and metaphor, inducing transformations that are not consciously malevolent. Rather, the transformation itself and whatever comes after is what we fear. Thanks.
Thank you so much. That was fascinating and also spot on time. So
Excellent.
those are the two key properties for conference talk. Okay, so our second speaker will be Saraliza Anzaldúa from the California Institute of Integral Studies, who will be speaking to us on Monsters or Mutants, ? The fine line of humanity in the developmental ecological according to the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles.
Excellent.
Who else was terrified? Like, my heart's racing. I was so scared. Good morning. So I'm going to be talking about the kind of liminality between monsters and mutants and how our cosmological assumptions will lead us to either include or exclude some bodies as monsters or mutants. Just quick mention of some hazards ahead. Around the middle, there are going to be some mentions of eugenics and genocide and some pretty dark stuff. So why mutants? Well, as I mentioned, depending on our cosmological assumptions, so how the world is built, we're going to make certain assumptions about what a deviant body is and then label those bodies as monsters, freaks, marvels, and mutants. And historically, those bodies have been marked for excessive control and even death. So by unpacking our assumptions, we can see how those threads are woven together to either make assumptions of bodies as natural or unnatural. Here is a picture of John Eckhart Jr., who was an actor, magician, performer. So I'm going to be talking about a dialectic between a typological view and a developmental view. So a typological view is a view characterized by an assumption that the world is populated by a set of kinds. So each kind or type has essential characteristics, and there's little variation within that kind. And that any variation can be explained as an anomaly that leads one to assume that that is a deviance from that category and therefore an error. So here's an example of a blonde zebra. So on the typological view, the blonde zebra is an error. It's something deviant from a type. And then based on what kind of typologist you are, you might make an assumption of, oh, well, that's a monster, that's a mutant, oh, what a wondrous marvel. So some examples of the typological view are divine cosmology. So that is where you assume that a divine entity has set up the world and populated it by kinds, and so any deviation from that kind is through divine will, omen, punishment, or just because. A natural philosophical view where malformations exist because the rules of nature weren't followed. And then modern hardline geneticists that assume that all deviations are because of malformations rooted in genetic code. So because of time constraints, I'm not going to go through each view, and here are just some examples. So the famous monster of Vina was an omen based on the cosmological view said to foretell war in Italy. I've mentioned how the natural philosophical view moves away from divine cosmology to assume that any variation is because the rules of nature weren't followed. So this was like a pre-science view that had a range of explanations where, well, the rules weren't followed because too much semen was used, not enough semen was used, the womb was too narrow. So very early playing with scientific exploration of the natural world. But both of these views, in both of those views, hybridity played a really big characteristic in ways to distinguish deviance of those bodies. So here's an example of the Minotaur, a boundary crossing between the human type and the animal type, in particular the bull. And while there were other examples of ways to mark monstrous body, something was too big for its type, too small for its type, had too many arms for its types. Hybridity played a really significant role in these two positions. So it turns out typology is an ideological view. It's really hard to get rid of, and you'll see it crop up in hardline geneticists. So they assume that kinds are determined by their genetic. You want to know what something is? Test its genes, and that there's going to be no variation with those genes. A type is set by its genetic code. There's also little variation between genetic kinds, and any anomalies can be explained, as I mentioned, by bad genes or malformation of those genetic expressions. So here's a quote from Armand Leroy: "Mutations are deficiencies in particular genes, errors made by the machinery that copies or repairs DNA." So a typologist would look at this two-headed turtle and say, bad genes, something went wrong in its genetic code. So the problems with typology is that it's really hard to pin down essential features of a kind because there's always variation within the population. Everything that we are now as people arose from mutations, genetic variation, blue eyes, red hair, hair itself. You can find exceptions of dogs without fur, birds without wings. The second problem with typology is that kinds evolve generationally over time, and they co-evolve with other populations. And there's always a sharing between populations that are supposedly distinct on the typologist view. So you can think of the examples of Homo sapiens that share genetic code with chimpanzees and Neanderthals, but there's also the fact that we share genetic code beyond our assumed kinds, so roundworms and mice due to bacterial and viral transfer. And third, it ignores the significance of internal and external environmental development, which next suggests that genes are just part of the picture. So a typologist will say, oh, you want to know the sex of something? Test its genes. That doesn't work on species like turtles and other reptiles because they're temperature-dependent species. So their sexual expression is determined by the temperature when the egg is gestating. You can also think of examples of various beetle species. A typologist will say, oh, you want to know if it's going to have big or small horns or horns at all. Test its genes. That's not how it works. The the appearance and size of horns on beetle species is determined by a myriad of things: temperature, nutrition, the location and size of its eyes. And then we can also think about just the fact that we walk. That's not in our genes. It's something we develop through in-process spontaneous movement. Think back to a picture of Johnny Eek. He would not have been able to walk on his hands or do types of movements based on the genetic typologist view because his genes were malformed. Clearly, that wasn't the case. And in extreme cases, typology can lead to harm when the world that you are trying to work with doesn't match your view. So you try and impose your typological view on the world that doesn't match it in reality, and this leads you towards excessive control and even excessive harm in those bodies. So we live in a world with all kinds of examples, unfortunately. So racial typologists, eugenicists, and the impact of involuntary sterilization here in the US, biased IQ tests developed and put in place in public education and state institutions to determine educational tracks or even whether you were mentally competent. And then various better breeding organizations that pushed anti-misogynist laws. You can think of section gender typologists that make decisions on intersect individuals and forcing them to undergo involuntary surgeries to make them fit into a section gender type. You can also think about the example of the management and eradication of bodies with disabilities, exploited for entertainment, forced to undergo sterilization, or institution and incarceration. So in each case, the bodies don't fit into the neat typological categories that the typologist assumes. So in opposition to typological thinking, we have developmental thinking. So it's characterized by attention to evolutionary history, allows for flexibility both within and between populations, and it emphasizes an interstitial relationality and potential alternatives. So here's a picture from Cotter Bannerton on the epigenetic landscape. So the ball represents your genes, but it's the landscape that the ball moves from that determines its development. And the landscape in particular is held up by pegs that can be tightened or loosened, and those ropes will allow the landscape to be flexible. So it's not your genes that determine who you are, it's how they develop across the landscape. So I mentioned the example of the turtles, but there's even so many examples how we as humans develop, both in embryo and as babies and throughout the course of our lives. So the developmental view of epigenetic shows us that there's variation within populations. So the example of the corn, a typologist might take certain examples of corn and say, oh, well, that's just a malformation of genes, not realize that actually that population has lots of variety, both generationally and just over time. That there's variation between populations. So a typologist will say, oh, these are two distinct entities, and not realize that elephants and manatees are related, and that we co-evolve because we are interdependent just by virtue of living on the planet. So bees and flowers are a common example of co-evolving species that develop together. So now to the fun part, Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles, a way out of typology. So why comics? Why not just stick with philosophy? Well, first, the phenomenology of effective transmissions. We get carried away by the stories. And so what is it like to be a monstrous body in a typological world? What does it feel like to live in a developmental world? And with that awareness, narratives offer us a possible way to develop a developmental consciousness. So a very, very brief introduction to Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. It started with Peter Laird and Kevin Eastman as comics in 1984, Mirage Comics. It has spawned off in numerous TV series, movie series, and various comic arcs. But in each of these universes, there's always the Master Splinter, who is either a human given rat qualities or a rat given human qualities, that raises 4 turtles, which are mutated by this green ooze, sometimes called mutagen. They become ninjas, and their arch enemy is the Shredder, head of the Foot Clan, who wants to take over the world. And so the Shredder tries to destroy the turtles because they stand in his way of world domination. So it's very interesting because over the course of these many universes, there's a shift from an early typological view towards a developmental view. So in all the universes, there's always examples of hybrid creatures, bodies that cross boundaries between the human and animal. So there's the example of Splinter I mentioned. There's also their friend ally, April, who gets turned into a cat, but by the end of the episodes, returned to her former human body. And in a recent IDW comic arc, there is the example of Janika, who is a ninja foot enemy turned ally that suffers a fatal wound and gets a transfusion from Leonardo and becomes a mutant turtle. So these hybrid bodies are really reminiscent of the early view of natural philosophy where hybridity marks the distinction of a monstrous body. So in these worlds, there are sets of types, the human and the animal, and any variation of those boundaries marks the body as a monster because it is a mutant. And so we get into that genetic typological view where these development and boundary crossing marks the body as something dangerous, as something to be controlled, as something to be annihilated. And we see this reiterated a lot throughout the early franchises. In one example, Shredder, the villain, shouts, "Man over beast, that is the natural order, bow to your master." But in later franchises, we shift towards a developmental view. So the top picture is from the 2012 series, where we find out that the alien Krang exposed Earth millions of years ago to the mutagen, and so everything on Earth is a mutant. It's not just the hybrid creatures. From the bottom is from the Rise 2018 series, where we find out that an alien ship with the Krang crashed on Earth. The ooze was exposed to various animals, and they developed their own society over thousands of years. So it's not a boundary crossing between the human and the animal, it's just evolutionary development of their own species, who have hotels and apparently enjoy a demolition derby. So what can we learn from the Teenage Mutant Turtles in terms of affect? Well, as I mentioned, what it would be to be a monstrous body, to have to hide into the shadows, to not only be constantly exposed to the existential threat of violence, but also the psychological and spiritual toll it takes. So they are repeatedly targeted by government organizations for experimentation and annihilation. And there's a really heartbreaking scene in the top right where Mikey wants a friend so badly he exposes himself to his karate hero, Chris Bradford, only to learn that Chris Bradford works for the Shredder. Chris Bradford kidnaps and ties up Michelangelo to lure his family to rescue him. And Mikey says, "Why are you doing this? I thought you were my friend." And Chris Bradford says, "You really thought someone like me could be a friend with a freak like you? Pathetic." And your heart just breaks along with Michelangelo because he's not even given the basic kindness of friendship. So by watching Teenage Mutant Turtles, you're less likely to develop the extreme typological position because you see to the harm that it leads to. In one case in the 2003 series, there's the organization Humans Against the Extraterrestrial Threat that steal a nuclear bomb to destroy New York City and rid the world of aliens and mutants. There's also the example of Bishop in the recent Tales of the Teenage Mutant Turtles. Bishop is reimagined as a roboticist whose life work gets destroyed in a battle where the Turtles try and save New York. And so she makes robots to exterminate all mutants, and like robots are wont to do, their AI develops self-awareness and realizes, well, humans are mutants too. So they try and destroy all, both humans and mutant bodies. And then we're more likely to be open to entities that challenge our assumptions because we realize that a typological view is really a faulty ideology. It has no basis in reality. So in a divergent from former universes, in the recent Mutant Mayhem, the Turtles exposed themselves because everybody saw them save New York, and they reintegrate into their community that they've been saving for so many years, and they go to high school for the first time. And then I mentioned that on that narrative journey, so feeling that heartbreak, feeling what it is to live in the shadows your whole life and wanting to be part of the community, we are more likely to develop a consciousness that is rooted in interconnectedness. So we're more likely to be mindful of our integral relationships and how we are co-evolving, co-creating in the web of life. So we move away from the typological position where in the great chain of being, everything is isolated. Everything is in a hierarchy because it is a type that is on its own journey. And that journey for each type has little to no variation. Towards a developmental consciousness, here we see The Tree of Life by Leonard Eisenberg. I prefer the language, the shrub of life. More people are adopting that language because it is a network where you can see that actually everything is related. And here, The Evolution of the Hominids by the American Museum of Natural History, where we see that types, though they have variation and on their journey, it's really more haphazard, and there's so much development and potential within each type. So it's really a fallacy to assume that each type, whether that be, I like to use the example of if I showed someone a lemon and an orange, oh yeah, two distinct things, but you would make a mistake because they share ancestry, and there's so much variation within those supposed categories. So more towards an interconnected view where you see not only everything in relation because types overlap, but also variation within category because there's so much variation. I'm just looking around this room. And so I think that one of the things Teenage Mutant Turtles can offer us is that kind of narrative journey without all the hard work of doing just philosophy, that kind of, I mean, I'm a philosopher, I love philosophy, but if you've ever tried to read some of the old medieval tomes, it can get pretty depressing pretty quickly, and I think that that's one of the beauties and one of the powers of narrative, and why I love Turtles so much, and why I'm such a huge fan. So thank you, and Turtle Power.
Thank you so much. Oh. Thank you so much, Annalisa. I'm a medievalist, so I'll try not to take that too much to heart. In fact, most medieval things are depressing, it's true. It was not the cheeriest time to be a human, I think. So, thank you very much. Our third and final speaker will be Henry Kamerling from Seattle University, who will speak to us on Rise of the Mushrooms, Apocalyptic Visions from the Left in DC's Poison Ivy: The Virtuous Circle from 2022, and HBO's The Last of Us from 2023.
There we go. And then your video's like right behind it, so you can see it right there.
Yeah.
Oops.
You're a genius. Thanks.
All right. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. It's so wonderful to be back here at the Festival of Monsters again this year and discuss with you two recent apocalyptic narratives, the DC graphic novel Poison Ivy, Virtuous Cycle, and the HBO Max streaming series The Last of Us. Both these texts present an apocalyptic vision where the rapid spread of fungus-based infections either threaten an advancing Holocaust or cause the complete breakdown of the modern world. Now, I will argue that the artists involved in these projects use what I'm calling the mushroom apocalypse to examine a range of politically leftist concerns about capitalism, about global climate change, about the coercive nature of state power, while similarly advancing a worldview that centers feminist perspectives and queer subjectivities, though today I'm going to focus mostly on the climate and environmental aspect of these particular texts. Before we jump into our analysis, I want to provide a brief overview of these texts. So Poison Ivy, pictured here, she's a top-tier villain in the DC universe, and she makes her first appearance in 1966 and quickly becomes one of Batman's arch enemies. Because of a science experiment gone wrong, she's able to communicate with plants and direct them to take action. Ivy draws her power from something called the Green, which is a kind of life force that binds all organic material in the earth together. Ivy is a fierce defender of the plant and mushroom and non-human animal kingdoms, and she's often depicted as an uncompromising eco-terrorist and plant-based revolutionary. As Avalon expertly explained, mushrooms aren't plants, and they are this liminal entity, and so they have their own separate position in the biologic taxonomy. The Virtuous Cycle, the comic story that I'm going to be focusing on, is a sort of 6-story comic arc from 2022, written by G. Willow Wilson and drawn beautifully by Marcio Takara and R.F. Prianto. And when we pick up the story here, turns out that Ivy has actually lost most of her powers in an earlier battle, and she's despondent at being separated from the Green. And then she's fueled by her hatred for all humans. And so she decides to take a genetically engineered hallucinogenic fungus called Ophiocordyceps lamia. I probably butchered that. I practiced it so much, but I probably didn't pronounce it correctly. Anyway, the lamia fungus kills all humans who come into contact with it, turning them into mushroom-like zombies. Ivy's plan is to disperse the lamia fungus throughout humanity, ushering in the mushroom apocalypse and creating what she calls the 6th great mass extinction. So Ivy is presented here as an uncompromising revolutionary and eco-plant mushroom-based terrorist. As the story develops, we follow Ivy as she travels from Gotham City to Seattle, dispersing the lamia fungus along the way. All the while, Ivy is hounded by a guy named Dr. Jason Woodrue, who's another iconic DC villain. And Woodrue is sometimes also known as the Green Man. And like Ivy, the Green Man is half plant, half human. But instead of being an environmentalist, he just wants to amass power and wealth and profit off his bioweapon creations. The story reaches its climax in Seattle. So I'm going to tell you the ending, so spoiler alert, where Ivy and the Green Man battle to the death, with Ivy finally killing Woodrue in vicious plant-on-plant violence. Ivy's only able to survive at the end by eating the dead half-plant man and gaining some of his miraculous healing powers and possibly reconnecting her with the Green. After her defeat and consumption of Woodrue, Ivy decides to pause her genocidal plan and try to reconnect with the humans she loves, and this includes her lover and girlfriend, Harley Quinn. So in classic superhero tradition, we have a threatened apocalypse, but one that is, in the end, averted. If we turn our attention then to The Last of Us, that's a streaming show that I hope some of you have seen, based on an enormously successful action-adventure video game from 2013. The video game was written by Neil Druckmann, and Druckmann, together with Craig Mazin at HBO, developed the streaming show. Now, I'm going to focus solely on the streaming show, and the video world is deep and rich in its own right. The main story opens about 2 decades on from an initial fungal outbreak where the modern society, governments, militaries, science, technology, capitalisms have all failed, and we find ourselves in a bleak post-apocalyptic world with pockets of humans collected in quarantine zones, or QZs, often overseen by some kind of like proto-fascist government, at times called Fedra. The story's plot begins in the Boston QZ and centers on Joel, played by Pedro Pascal, and his young charge, Ellie, played by Bella Ramsey. And Joel is a hard man who's lost nearly everything, and he plans on traveling west in search of his missing brother, Tommy. In the process, he collects Ellie, who it turns out is immune to the cordyceps infection, and Joel promises to deliver Ellie to a lab in Wyoming where doctors hope to make a vaccine for the fungal infection. The first season follows Joel and Ellie's journey through an apocalyptic wasteland where they encounter all manners of hardship, both fungal and human in nature, on their quest to locate Tommy and the lab. So what situates these narratives of the mushroom apocalypse on the political left? That's the question that I really want to explore. And one of the clearest signifiers of these texts' leftist politics is the conversation that they develop about climate change. These stories are examples of the current climate fiction or cli-fi literature, while in the Poison Ivy story, the anti-capitalist perspective is a more prominent feature than in Virtuous Cycle. Both texts explain that the mushroom apocalypse is caused by human inaction on global warming. And we're going to look at a clip, so I'm going to have to escape this. Let's see if this is set up just right. So we're going to see in this clip, it's the very first opening sequence of The Last of Us, and it's a flashback to 1968, so well before the story initially takes place. And we see two epidemiologists who are appearing on a talk show debating current threats to society. Current there means current 1968, right? So, and we're going to just watch 2 minutes of this.
Fungus. Dr. Schoenheis, you're in distress.
Fungal infection of this kind is real, but not in humans.
True, fungi cannot survive if its host's internal temperature is over 94 degrees. And currently, there are no reasons for fungi to evolve to be able to withstand higher temperatures. But what if that were to change? What if, for instance, the world were to get slightly warmer? Well, now, there is reason to evolve. One gene mutates, and an Ascomycetia, Candida, ergot, Cordyceps, Aspergillus, any one of them could become capable of burrowing into our brains and taking control, not of millions of us, but billions of us. Billions of puppets with poisoned minds, permanently fixed on one unifying goal: to spread the infection to every last human alive by any means necessary. And there are no treatments for this, no preventatives, no cures. They don't exist. It's not even possible to make them.
So if that happens,
We lose.
All right. Let's see if I can go back to the full screen here. All right, look at that.
Yes.
Oh, there we go. All right, so here, thank you for your patience about that. Here, the prelude clearly establishes the nature of the threat, which is global warming, and the catastrophic consequences that stem from humans' inability to seriously address this problem. Of course, over the next 40 years, the Earth does warm up a few degrees, and of course, the fungus cordyceps does mutate to be able to infect humans. And in the end, The Last of Us presents its viewers with a storyline where, as the scientist says, we lose. In this aspect, then, The Last of Us exists as a cautionary tale on global climate change and the price to be paid for human inaction. We see some of the same details in Virtuous Cycle. We have an even more detailed critique, actually, I would argue, about late-stage capitalism running throughout this story. Here, in a kind of prologue to the main story, we find Ivy standing before a giant chemical plant in the distance, pumping pollution out into the night air. Ivy is positioned in front of the plant's sewage drain, which is also dropping waste into the Liberty River. There are few perfect things now, Ivy explains. We've halted the natural evolution of our planet. When nature kills, Ivy continues, something new is born to replace what was taken, but the death we inflict is permanent. So naturally, Ivy gets a job in the plant, seeding its HVAC system with the Lamia fungus, and when the time is right, she blows it up, killing the people inside and hopefully dispersing the Lamia fungus out into Gotham's night air. A little later on in the story, we find Ivy traveling across the Southwest, and she finds herself in a diner among some truly wonderful human beings. Here we see Ivy imagining the future that's coming for them, the future that's coming actually for all of us. As Ivy says, wildfire season is already longer and more intense than it was just 50 years ago. Ivy explains as we see a beautiful family running for the car as the wildfire closes in around them, while there are people trapped in the diner below who are engulfed in a holocaust of flames. Very soon, it will be impossible to stop. We have less than 20 years to save the planet, Ivy continues, arguing that half measures aren't enough anymore. The only way to spare the green from total destruction is to eliminate the problem. The problem, as Ivy understands it, are human beings, all of them, the good ones and the bad. And perhaps she's not wrong about this. So Virtuous Cycle is more explicit than The Last of Us in placing the blame for these things on late-stage capitalism and the environmental degradation that's necessarily its handmaiden. Ivy's plan to use the spores to usher in the sixth mass extinction is brutal, sort of classic supervillain stuff. But the story raises a question emerging from leftist perspectives in political spaces about who should properly be understood as the protagonist of the story, the human beings or the vast array of other life forms that call the planet home. Another and perhaps deeper connection to the story's leftist politics in these texts is the way they present a perspective on what we now call posthumanism. Posthumanism doesn't mean like beyond the human or without humans, but operates as an intellectual critique of European and American enlightenment and the centering of human beings as the core of the imaginative world. In this way, posthumanism calls into question the primacy of like human rights that is above animal rights or plant-based rights or mushroom-based rights, and critically interrogates humanity's presumed domination over the earth and the earth's other life forms. Posthumanism then rejects the anthropocentric supremacy that resides implicitly or otherwise in so much of our political and cultural world from the 1600s on, at least in white-centered Western spaces, right? So we see this posthumanist perspective in Virtuous Cycle and The Last of Us in the way these texts ask the question, hasn't human beings' disastrous stewardship of the earth exposed their position at the apex of the planet as morally bankrupt? Collectively, then, these tales ask if it's not time to make room for other species or kingdoms, plant or mushroom as the case may be, to take the lead. Now, we see this posthumanist perspective in the way the texts use plant or mushroom-based horror, as the case may be. Brittany Roberts contends that the grounding of plant horror is found in plants that, quote, refuse to stay a thing, because the often sentient, mobile, and hungry for human flesh plants and mushrooms, quote, resolutely breach the taxonomic and ontological boundaries in which plant life has historically been fixed. Or as T.S. Miller has explained, the monster plant exists as an error to be corrected. And yet Virtuous Cycle and The Last of Us invert the dread typically found in plant or mushroom horror. In contrast to Miller's assertion that vegetative or fungal monstrosities exist chiefly as an error to be corrected, these stories provide an imaginative landscape where it is the human-built, capitalist, and war-making world of men that is, to borrow Noel Carroll's terminology, impure. We see this partly in the way these texts deploy plant horror. Here, for example, we see the results of Poison Ivy's handiwork, having turned a few of her antagonists into mushroom people. Their infected and decomposing bodies are having been taken over by the new Cordyceps lamia hosts, mushrooms sprouting from their eyes and their mouth and consuming their bodies inside and out. Here, from The Last of Us, we have a few images, and on the left you see Tess, who was an early partner of Joel's, about to be, kissed, in quotes perhaps, transformed into an infected. And then on the right, we see a desiccated post-human body covered in cordyceps mushrooms sprouting from every orifice. And then on the left, we have a slide, a vision, Avalon already showed this one on the far left, which I really appreciate. You see it's a feral clicker zombie or mushroom zombie hybrid. And on the right, you see the costume staff putting together some of their zombie mushroom hybrid creations. And you can see the images in each of these tales is strikingly similar. These mushroom zombie people are weird and creepy, sure, and emblems of the abject, that is, signifying the impossibility of the body to ward off threats and remain always one single coherent identity. And maybe there's an interesting conversation there about typology, about the inability for kind to be set in some sort of permanence. And so that's an interesting thought that I just had in listening to your talk. But these mushroom creatures are also disturbingly beautiful in their own way. And as viewers and readers, we may revolt at the idea of becoming a monster mushroom, but is it really so bad? And not just for the humans, but for the planet and all the other living things on it, right? So in Last of Us, we see a world like this one, born in the wake of the rise of the mushrooms. It's a place where, as we see here, nature has made headway, both in reclaiming the land from the perversions of man-made civilization. And it's a place where there is room again If we look at like these images of living creatures to grow and thrive, here we see the buffaloes returning to the plains and giraffes having escaped a local zoo who roam free and peaceful. So sure, humans haven't fared so well and they've suffered, but what of it? Ask the buffalo which world they would rather live in, the one where the humans are in charge or the ones where mushrooms have taken over. So Virtuous Cycle also offers similar kind of images and stories, gives readers beautiful images of the natural world reclaiming otherwise distressed landscapes. In these two panels, we find that Ivy has planted a tree and helped that tree grow to maturity overnight. And then in the panel on the right, she defends her genocidal plan, saying, "More than anything else, I don't want you to think that the whole thing is about death. It's not. It's about cultivating life on a scale we can barely imagine, vibrant and blooming and eternal." So here Ivy is clearly offering and articulating a post-humanist perspective. Her worldview decenters the human as the protagonist of human history and future progress. The planet's future may be thriving and vibrant and life-filled and glorious even, just not for humans, and not if humans are allowed to stick around and do their thing. Last of Us also offers some stories, some bleak stories of humanity gone wrong. I'm going to skip over this just a little bit. We meet some really bad people in Last of Us. So there's this humanity gone wrong on both the left and the right there. And then, but we also find more positive elements of humanity gone right in the post-apocalyptic mushroom, new mushroom world. For example, we have Joel and Tess develop a friendship and partnerships of sorts with Bill and Frank, two gay men who've turned their small upstate town into kind of survivalist safe haven. It's also a place where Bill and Frank develop an achingly beautiful love affair, one that nourishes them as the larger world outside falls apart. And then we also find, in a similar vein, although far more brief, Joel and Ellie stumble upon an indigenous couple living happily, surviving the apocalypse together in a remote cabin in the woods. And then Joel eventually finds his brother Tommy living in Jackson, Wyoming, which is a literal communist paradise. Right? So we have some more positive views of the post-mushroom apocalypse. I'm going to skip ahead to Ivy's conclusion. In its own way, The Last of Us kind of provides a vision of the world where Poison Ivy hopes to create, one where the natural world is not trampled under the feet of humans and their concrete steel and war-making creations. It's not that I dislike human beings, Ivy explains. As individuals, they're fine. What I hate, what keeps me up, grinding my teeth, is civilization. Collectively, we are an invasive species, sucking up every resource on the planet until all that's left is a ball of superheated concrete. The only way to save this beautiful blue marble is to get rid of all of us, every last one, even me. So in her final battle with the Green Man, Ivy explains one final time why humanity simply can't be trusted to fix the problems facing the planet and other life forms. You of all people should know, Jason, Ivy rages as she stands over the dying Woodrue. When humans manipulate nature, nothing they create ever remains under their control. In Virtuous Cycle and The Last of Us, then, readers and viewers are presented with images and stories of nature unbound, nature fighting back, and sometimes nature winning in the war against anthropocentric dominance. Both tales are clearly situated as examples of cli-fi and eco-horror literature. We glimpse the coming climate apocalypse in much of its terror, but we are told by Ivy, probably correctly, that half measures aren't enough anymore. But the real-world solutions to these problems, that is the real-world solution that we might all engage in here, are difficult if we center human beings in this story. It's not difficult for Ivy because she doesn't really care what happens to humans. And she possesses the power to possibly make the change that she wants to see happen by ushering in the mushroom apocalypse. In this context, then, Ivy's promised Holocaust and the presentation of some more organic and healthy post-apocalyptic human communities in The Last of Us stands in contrast to the climate apocalypse that we are all careening towards right now today. These stories, in their own way, detail the end stage of the Anthropocene. The mushrooms may not rescue humanity. Indeed, they may bring about its demise. But in this telling, they have the power to save everything else, and that just might be enough. Thank you.
Well, thank you all so much for 3 really interesting papers. Now we open it up for Q&A. I think we've got about a half an hour for that. So, questions from the audience? Yes.
Can I have you wait until mainly because we're filming this, so I want to make sure everybody's voice gets heard.
Hi, thank you all so much for your wonderful talks. I had a question for Henry. I have not read Virtuous Cycle, so my apologies if I'm misreading the ending, but I'm really interested in how the ending you described impacts its environmental messaging. I'm a writer, and as writers, we often hear that superhero narratives are problematically conservative in form because they present change as a threat to the traditional order, and the success of the hero is the restoration of that status quo. And it sounds like Virtuous Cycle in some ways conforms to that traditional narrative arc. The ending is a restoration or protection of the status quo, even if it's reiterating a message of radical environmental and social change. So I'm wondering, do you feel like that dodge of not giving us like the success of the radical vision at the end is troubling the story's message? Or is the writing, like we've seen some quotes here that are very didactic, sort of messagey enough to overcome the structure of the narrative?
Yeah, I mean, thank you so much. That's a great question. And yeah, maybe I should talk into it. I don't know, my voice is pretty loud. I imagine you can all hear me. That's a fabulous question. There is a fundamental conservative nature of these serially told superhero stories. And Wilson does pull her punches at the end, right? Because the mushroom apocalypse is threatened but averted. And so there's this really potentially powerful story, but it's not just a one-off because Ivy's going to come back and Woodrow will probably come back in some form, even though he's been killed and eaten, because it's the serial nature of the superhero and comic book story. It's interesting that Ivy is a villain who's the protagonist of the story. And you do get such a powerful and clear political message earlier in the text. I do feel like the end, not just of this story, but of superhero tales in general, struggle to have a more radical or powerful punch at the end. And so the threatened apocalypse is the world that the superhero narrative kind of lives in. And we don't see what happens on the other side because either the superhero shows up to stop that from happening, or in Ivy's case, she decides to, pull her punches. And she makes some nod at the very end to doing something like she's gonna still continue her eco-terrorism, but it's gonna be more directed, right, at like businesses. We saw that in the very first scene from the story. So yeah, I don't know that I would call it disappointing because it's sort of just expected, and I appreciated the ride. Because Wilson does stitch into her story some really interesting and radical politics, and then the artwork is fabulous, right? And so, yeah, I don't know that I think, but absolutely, I would agree that that's generally what happens in our superheroic narratives. Yeah. You're a writer, is that right? So yeah, like, what do you do with that? Like, because I'm from Seattle, and G. Will Wilson lives in Seattle, and so we've had some conversations. And, one of the things she says is that this was sort of a project that was not particularly prominent for DC, and so she felt like no one was really paying attention to what she was writing. And so she felt like she could slip in more radical stuff. But at some point, particularly in the comic book world, as opposed to maybe other kinds of literature, there are minders, that she has to please, and they have to sign off on her stuff. And so that constrains the potential for her own personal politics even more so. And, if you're writing just a novel on your, I don't know why I'm gesturing to you, because you were talking about them, though, right? You were, so that you have some more freedom. Yeah.
Okay, yes. Oh, hang on for the mic, please.
Hi, thank you everyone. Amazing presentations. This is a question for Avalon, but maybe Henry can speak a little bit to it because he also talked about fungi. So Avalon, you talk a lot about fungi as foreign agents rendering the familiar strange, and you talk about fungi representing an end to the recognizable self, or an end of the recognizable self. I found those articulations to be very compelling. So I'm curious if you've thought about or written about or begun to research the fact that fungi are already an integral part of the human body and the human corporeal subjectivity. Fungi are always on our skin right now at this moment. They're also an integral part of our digestive system. They're in our intestines, our stomach. They're an integral part of the gut mycobiome is what they're being called, which is part of the gut microbiome. So they're deeply embedded and interconnected with the human body and with our corporeal self. And so I'm curious about how that relates to what you talked about, how they represent an end of the recognizable self, but they're such an inherent part of who we are already.
Sure. I'll start by saying I'm not a scientist. I feel like that's an important preface. But I watched other faces as you were reading your question, and I think everybody was discomfited by remembering that there are other things living inside of us. And so I think part of this is a conversation about challenging our conception of human individualism, and as you mentioned, human exceptionalism as part of an ecosystem that is fundamentally interconnected. We don't like to believe that, right? Like, we are raised in late capitalist meritocracy, which loves to believe that we do everything on our own. And we don't. And so perhaps there is also something of the abject here, right? Kristeva's conversation about that which gives us meaning and breaks down meaning, that which is part of us that we actively seek to expel, that I think is fundamental to the conversation. Thanks for bringing it up. Do you have anything to add?
I mean, sir, I don't know, I think you can hear me without the thing, but I was really animated by, because I feel like that comment could also be addressed by, like, there's a breakdown of classification. Not a breakdown of classification, we've got classification or typology, that's just wrong. And so we're not just us, we're a bunch of stuff. And I'm really animated by this idea, but what if that bunch of stuff is the hero of the story and not the villain? What if it's not something to be feared, but something, what if that's a way we reconsider who we are? Like, what does we mean in that context?
I do think that, sorry, especially in the kind of typological view that governs the Euro-American modern view, there is a lot of human exceptionalism rooted in this typological purist view. So we are one thing, and it's just that one thing. But as you noted, there's bacteria and fungi, and a lot more parasites than you would expect. And that's just like a basic fact of reality. We've co-evolved, and we've co-created with the rest of the world. And I think the example of mycelium, and I really loved y'all's presentation, and I love just how there was that. So I think there's one way to understand it as the kind of hybridous monster, the crossing of boundaries. But that horror is rooted in the idea that, myself as a distinct and pure entity has been threatened. And that's where that fear comes from.
I experience delight, not horror, joy, not horror. When I go on forest walks, I see fungal bodies. I point at the fungal bodies. Wow, they're inside of me. That's an extension of my corporeal being. It's not horrible. It's exciting and joyful for me.
Yeah. There's probably also thematically something to discuss here about the idea of betrayal from one's own form. Right, that for a lot of people, particularly people who experience different disabilities, many of which are invisibilized, the conception of betrayal by your own body is a deeply resonant theme for lots of folks. So the idea that there is an agent inside of you that you cannot control or even understand or communicate with there's a lot there to dissect.
Okay, and I'm just going to remind everybody we're using microphones because we are videotaping.
Hi, I just want to echo the thanks for your guys' presentation. Very compelling things. After Henry's presentation, I just can't stop thinking about Little Shop of Horrors and the apocalypse ending and the cow plant from The Sims. So my question was, I guess, kind of the cultural moment that we find ourselves in related to things like plant moms and plant parents. Is the mic still working? Okay, so I'll just project. Plant moms and plant parents, as well as I think there's also an interesting moment in terms of the iconography of the mushroom and how, like, I am speaking kind of generally because I haven't done research into it, but from my own perspective, like specifically like people who would identify as queer or female, getting things like tattoos of mushrooms in a very kind of like, it's seen as like this kind of sexy thing, or like kind of the beautification of decomposition and decay is like present in the moment. And I'm curious as to what you all think about both of those kind of cultural things in relation to your topic, as well as how that that connection might speak to maybe the allure of the plant or the mushroom or fungi being an escape of typological restraints that we have on ourselves. Thinking of, you know, mushrooms specifically being as a signifier of liminality, and how that in itself, the liminal state of maybe gender or sex might be appealing to a modern discussion of those things. So thank you again.
I was going to say.
Oh, okay. Okay. I supervise the Gender and Sexuality Alliance Club at the high school where I teach in Colorado. And I cannot tell you how many of those kids come in with iconography of mushrooms, moths, and possums. I think there is something very distinct in queerness about deciding intentionally to love that which is like stereotypically unlovable and uncharacterizable. And so I think mushrooms as a feature, if you're a queer person growing up in a heteronormative society, or if you're any marginalized identity growing up in a society that does not privilege that marginalized identity, then you look around for things that are like you, right? And if you're queer and you're looking around at mushrooms and you're saying, this thing doesn't belong to any clearly identifiable or legible category, that's like me. And so I think it's a really cool emblem of things like queerness.
I love that. Yeah, I'm sorry. I love that. That's very, yeah, thank you for that. I think it's really interesting to think that the kids come in with like a tattoo. I mean, they're all tattooed now, but Avalon did a really amazing job sort of answering this question, why mushrooms? I mean, she has I really appreciated that part of your presentation. And I think it dovetails really excellently with Saraliza's conversation about, you know, this desire to want to classify and put things in rigid categories, and which is fool's gold, right? It's interesting to think about these two particular texts, The Last of Us and Poison Ivy's Virtuous Cycle, and I touched on it just very briefly, but and in a larger paper I would spend more time talking about this, but these are both, they both foreground queer stories, right? Queer subjectivities, and so the mushrooms are in part a way to tell that story, and so I've sort of thought about why mushrooms, and you did a good job unpacking that. Because of their liminal position, as a way to explore all kinds of liminality, but in these stories in particular, queerness. I mean, Poison Ivy's lover is Harley Quinn, who's a woman in another. I don't know if you guys know who Harley Quinn is. She's a major villain in the DC universe. And in Last of Us, the Ellie, played by Bella Ramsey, is also queer, and we encounter a lot of queer characters and see them in just everyday life situations. That's beautiful. The story with Bill and Frank, I don't know if you've seen that. It's like episode 3 of The Last of Us, and it won all sorts of awards, and I have a whole section on it in another writing. I mean, it's amazing, and I don't know, I wept like a baby, right, in watching that. And so clearly the whether it's Neil Druckmann or whether it's G. Willow Wilson or who's ever creating these stories sees in the fungal world a liminality, a way to explore things that don't fit conveniently in any category. And I do think they raise a question that's an interesting one, which is what's so bad about becoming a mushroom? And it gets back to that first comment. What if the things that we think of as abject and horrible are really wonderful?
Yeah, I think, I'm sorry, I keep thinking of addendums while other people are talking, but I think there might also be something ferociously, joyfully vindictive about affection for mushrooms for marginalized people, to say, like, you know what's going to happen to every single one of us when we die? We're going to rot. Fungi are going to eat us. You, me, everybody else. Like, whatever the differences are in our material conditions, that's what happens to all of us when we go, so why not embrace that as an emblem? Do you have anything to add? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I mean, I think Avalon and Henry, like, I've pretty much said all that can be said. I mean, I'd love hearing y'all talk and feel like actually I probably I didn't do as well in my presentation because I'm just so captivated by hearing y'all speak. Yeah, I think in terms of mushrooms, there's this field which is burgeoning in science, queer ecology, which is kind of a misnomer because all ecology is queer. Actually, our sexuality as a dimorphous species, as we understand it, because we're actually not so dimorphous as we think we are, is a form of typology, as I mentioned in terms of how there's a problem of sexual typologists and the way they enforce their view on sex and gendered children. So I think that feeds into why we're captivated by the mushroom, because they are multiplicitous, and that multiplicity is what draws us because we see ourselves reflected in that, as well as other animal species, like our views on what father should be, and then male seahorses don't fit that model, and there's just so many examples in terms of how we see this, and the mushroom is so captivating because you have that multiplicity, and through that multiplicity you see these like vast networks that are working not only underneath us but through us and our spores in the air, and it just connects everything, and it feeds into that developmental thinking of, wow, we really are part of a life, and actually we're kind of such a small part of it, we're really like the minority here, and it pushes back against that typological anthropocentric view.
Thank you all. That was a really wonderful panel. I'm still trying to figure out how to ask this question, so I'm going to do the best I can. But Jeffrey Jerome Cohen ends his monster culture with "The monster stands at the threshold of becoming." And I wanted to ask if you could all talk a little bit about that in relation to your papers and maybe make connections between them, sort of this idea of what are the becomings that we're getting through your specific fungal or ecological kind of monsters.
I'm going to stop going first.
Like I said, I love hearing y'all talk. Oh, wow. Well, I think everyone here being monster colors, we know that the monster is potentiality, right? It's a way for us to like imagine and think through possibilities, and there's so much power in that. And I think, at least in terms of our focus here in this Monstrous Ecology panel, that kind of point where you realize, oh, there are actually a lot more possibilities and a lot more multiplicitous ways of being than I thought there were. It's simultaneously like wondrous, and you mentioned the sublime, so awe-inspiring, and it's fucking frightening. I mean, it's so terrifying. And it's kind of like this roller coaster ride where the stakes are just so high. And I think, I mean, there's all kinds of ways to react to that. I think on the two ends of the extreme are, like, one, you're like, yeah, I'm buying my ticket, let's go, let's see where this ride leads. And others, it's like, nope, I am very situated in the status quo, and I'm just gonna shore up my view. And I think in terms of what that tells us for our futures, I think the more we get in touch with this monster of ecology, the more we tap into that potentiality, and importantly, potentiality rooted in that multiplicity, I don't know if that bodes hope, but I think it's, on the right path. What do y'all think?
I think that's lovely. I think that on that note, perhaps the greatest weapon that late stage capitalism wields is making us believe that it is unchangeable. And so, like Ursula K. Le Guin said, that like its power seems inescapable, but so did the divine right of kings. So anything that disrupts status quos so dramatically reminds us that a better world is possible. And I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I like that you referenced the Le Guin quote, which is great. And I like the idea of standing. The monster stands at the border of whatever is coming next, and you can. I'm sure others in here will be talking about monsters from different perspectives, and sometimes, maybe often, the monster is the threat that needs to be defeated, and so that typology can be reasserted in a very conservative way. These particular texts that I'm working with, I think, offer a lot of very, like, the mushroom apocalypse is a hopeful one. And the writers and creators are using these stories of standing at the border and peering over into whatever is coming next in a hopeful way, because they're using those narratives to center a feminist perspective. So like they're the people who are producing change in these worlds. I mean, I didn't go into. There's a lot more that I didn't get a chance to say, but like you get these really powerful, kick-ass, badass women in these stories, and then you get these queer narratives, and you get this sort of anti-capitalist story. I mean, and so these creators are using these particular texts to foreground a hopeful vision of whatever comes next, peering over the edge into the next thing. Although that is often not the case with horror. But in these particular narratives, it is. And maybe there's something about, I wonder, I'm really animated by the earlier stories of mushrooms, right? Where you would situate them on the political spectrum from left to center to right, which is something that I'm particularly interested in thinking through.
So this is probably going to echo the last question a little bit, and I'm not sure whether it's a question or an observation, but I was really struck by the line, I think it's from the William Hope Hodgson story, about revulsion and desire. I'm not sure I have this in the right order, but it feels like there's such a powerful undercurrent of maybe hopeful desire in all of these, whether it's for the purifying quality of an apocalypse, whether it's that breakdown of an identifiable self, which is sometimes something we perhaps strive for in ingesting certain kinds of mushrooms, and even kind of breaking through the boundaries of rigid typologies as well. So can you speak to that role of desire and kind of the almost ecstatic qualities of the various narratives you guys are talking about?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's Julia Kristeva's objection. That which is part of us and not part of us, that which we define ourselves by the conspicuous absence of, and like those parts of us which we simultaneously seek to expel and assimilate and can't. And I don't know, I think there's something tremendously liberating in imagining, like, what if things were different and what if that were fine? I also think that fundamentally lots of apocalyptic narratives are power fantasies, and that a lot of the most mainstream apocalyptic narratives are also specifically white male power fantasies about like autonomy and lawlessness outside of systems. And so it's really cool to engage in apocalyptic narratives where it's like, what if actually this were for the queers, and like this breakdown of white heteronormative capitalist patriarchy benefited us? Like, what if it were okay?
Yeah, and I think what's distinct about the latter narratives is that it's a way of being, so you can have both revulsion and desire, and that's just how things are. You don't have to fit into a typologist position where, okay, either everything has to be good or everything has to be bad. It's not a dichotomy between good versus evil. It's a way of relating and being in a relationship with all things. And sometimes that's messy. Sometimes you'll have these moments of awe and rest, and sometimes it's going to be fucking terrifying. I mean, we have all manner of bacteria and parasites in me, and I accept that, but I don't want more.
Just a little more.
Yeah,
I want to think about it.
As a someone with a compromised immune system, I'm really glad we have modern antibiotics. But I'm also very keenly aware that we need bacteria, we need parasites, that it's part of the fabric and web of life. And so that way of in-process, spontaneous relating, rooted in a more developmental position, I think is what the narratives that focused on the marginalized positions speak to, rather than the more like, I'm the lone wolf that's going to save everybody with my masculine power. I will always love creature features, but sometimes, oh man, I'm hoping that's going to be the next wave of horror genre. I'd love to see more creature features where it leans more into the narratives that we're talking about. I think it would be an interesting genre to watch.
Okay, I think we have one last question right here, and then remember that everybody can talk with each other at the coffee break, which is coming up in just a minute.
This question's for Henry. I guess my question is, do the anti-capitalist threads in The Last of Us, do they represent leftism as we understand from anarchists and communists, Marx and Engels, and all the great 19th and 20th century revolutionaries? Do they represent, does The Last of Us, do those anti-capitalist elements represent that leftism, or do they represent actually neo-feudalism? Some writers have pointed to the apartheid Israeli origins of Neil Druckmann's creative work, that elements of The Last of Us actually represent a deeply reactionary settler colonial understanding worldview. So I guess I'm questioning your premise about the leftism of The Last of Us.
So, yeah, thank you. I think it's I think there are some pretty clear signifiers of its left-leaning politics, even in its anti-capitalist formulations. And if you're just sticking with the text itself and not going into sort of Druckmann's, whether his own comments or his backstory or where he's coming from, if you just look at the text of, mind you, The Last of Us streaming show, not necessarily the video game, you know, there are a bunch of things that signify it. So climate change is clearly a problem, and human inaction on climate change is clearly climate change is real, and it's the thing that causes the mushroom apocalypse. That's clearly coming from a leftist perspective. The way in which the story centers marginalized peoples and minoritized peoples in powerful ways, clearly foregrounding those stories. So like those are really coming. Druckmann himself, and then Craig Mazan also at HBO, who helped create the streaming show, really coming at it from that perspective. In terms of the capitalist comment in particular, right, it is tricky. I do think that like the fantasy, I mean, ignoring your particular comment, but like there is an interesting conversation about the apocalypse, right? And so the apocalypse comes along. It matters very much, I think, like where you find safety in the post-apocalyptic world, who your left behind gang is, who's in charge. Is it like the white dude with the cowboy hat in the sheriff in Walking Dead, right? Like is the apocalypse a call to return to the past? Right? Is it like, hey, modern society has failed, modern governments have failed, modern technology has failed, science has failed, like the big government has failed, big government sucks, and they can't stop the zombie apocalypse or the mushroom zombie apocalypse from happening. And so that is often a very conservative political text. You do find in The Last of Us, one of the things that's interesting and refreshing about that is the left behind gang, to the extent there is one, and the more hopeful visions in that story, the people who are thriving in the zombie apocalypse are queer people, right? And people of color. And you get a literal, like, in the show described, like Jackson is a communist paradise. And at one point, Tommy in the show is like, no, this isn't communist. And his lover / wife, who's a black woman, is like, no, we're living in, this is communist. We have a commune. We're doing communism. Like, so that's the show. It's very straightforward in that context. In terms of it, I think it's a thin commentary. There's a lot more anti-capitalist narrative throughout Poison Ivy. It's more developed. But I would struggle to read The Last of Us streaming show as a sort of neo-feudalism in the way in which you mentioned. I don't know if Druckmann's read Marx. I don't know how deep he is in that, but capitalism is clearly one of the bad guys in that show, and is one of the things that produces global climate change, and human inaction on that is one of the things that then leads to the failure of the modern world. Yeah.
Okay, well, we are a minute or two over time, so can we thank the speakers once more?